Marcus Williams pulled his beat-up Honda Civic into the parking spot outside the small grocery store on Maple Street. The autumn evening air carried a chill that reminded him of the mountains in Afghanistan, where he'd spent 2 tours of duty with the 82nd Airborne Division. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 3 years since he'd returned home to his small town in Ohio. At 28, Marcus carried himself with the disciplined posture that military training had drilled into him. His dark hair was still cut short, and, despite the civilian clothes, there was something unmistakably military about the way he moved. The transition back to civilian life had been harder than he'd expected. The nightmares had mostly stopped, but finding steady work in a town where the main employer had closed its factory doors 5 years ago proved nearly impossible. Marcus locked his car and walked toward the store entrance, his limp barely noticeable unless someone was really looking. The IED explosion that had ended his military career had left him with a titanium rod in his left leg and a Purple Heart that sat in a drawer at home. He didn't like to think about it much, preferring to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on what he'd lost. As he reached for the store's glass door, he noticed a police cruiser parked across the street. Officer Derek Thompson sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the veteran pause. Marcus had encountered Thompson before, always in situations that seemed to escalate unnecessarily. There was something about the officer that reminded Marcus of the bullies he'd known in high school, men who used whatever authority they could find to make others feel small. Marcus pushed through the door and grabbed his small shopping basket. He needed just a few items: milk, bread, and something for dinner. Money was tight since he'd been laid off from his part-time job at the hardware store 2 weeks ago. His unemployment benefits barely covered rent on his small apartment, let alone groceries and the medications he needed for the chronic pain in his leg. He moved through the aisles methodically, choosing the cheapest options available. The store was nearly empty at this hour, just him and an elderly woman examining canned goods in the next aisle. Marcus picked up a loaf of day-old bread marked down for quick sale and headed toward the dairy section. Through the store's large front windows, he could see that the police cruiser was still there. Officer Thompson appeared to be writing something, but his eyes kept drifting toward the store entrance. Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same feeling he'd gotten on patrol when something didn't feel right. At the checkout counter, Marcus counted out exact change for his modest purchases. The young cashier, a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, smiled sympathetically as she watched him carefully organize his bills and coins. "Have a good evening, Mr. Williams," she said quietly. Marcus had been shopping here long enough that most of the staff knew him by name. They also knew about his military service, thanks to the small American flag pin he wore on his jacket and the occasional stories shared by his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who worked here part-time. "You too, Sarah," Marcus replied, gathering his plastic bag and heading for the door. The moment he stepped outside, he saw Officer Thompson getting out of his patrol car. The officer's hand rested casually on his utility belt, and there was a swagger in his step that Marcus recognized from his military days. This was the walk of someone looking for trouble, someone who enjoyed having power over others. "Evening," Thompson called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with false friendliness. Marcus nodded politely and continued walking toward his car. He'd learned that the best way to handle encounters like this was to be respectful but brief. Don't give them a reason to escalate, but don't appear weak or nervous either. "Hold on there." Thompson's voice had lost its false warmth. "I'd like to have a word with you." Marcus stopped and turned around slowly, his military training keeping his movements controlled and non-threatening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Thompson approached with deliberate steps, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe as if looking for something specific. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in this area. Someone matching your description was seen loitering around vehicles in this parking lot earlier today." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "I just got here 5 minutes ago to buy groceries. You can ask Sarah inside if you want to verify that." "Sarah?" Thompson raised an eyebrow. "You seem pretty familiar with the staff here. You spent a lot of time hanging around this place." The implication in the officer's tone was clear, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that he'd learned to control during his therapy sessions at the VA. He took a slow breath before responding. I shop here regularly. It's the closest store to my apartment. Thompson circled around Marcus's car, peering through the windows with exaggerated interest. This your vehicle? License and registration current? Yes, sir. Everything's up to date. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, making sure his movements were visible and unthreatening. He'd heard too many stories about situations like this going wrong, and he had no intention of becoming another statistic. As Marcus handed over his license, Thompson examined it with unnecessary scrutiny. Marcus Williams, 28 years old. You work around here. I'm between jobs at the moment, Marcus replied honestly. Thompson's expression shifted to something that looked almost like satisfaction. Between jobs. That's interesting. A lot of crime in areas where there's high unemployment. People get desperate, start looking for easy money. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily at his sides. The officer was clearly fishing, trying to provoke a reaction that would give him an excuse to escalate the situation. Marcus had seen this type of behavior before, both in the military and in civilian life. Some people were drawn to positions of authority not to serve and protect, but to dominate and control. Officer Thompson, Marcus said, reading the name tag on a man's uniform, I'm not looking for trouble. I just bought groceries and I like to go home. Thompson handed back the license with deliberate slowness. That's funny, Mr. Williams. Most people just call me officer. How do you know my name? Marcus realized his mistake immediately. He'd encountered Thompson before, but admitting that might make the situation worse. It's on your name tag, he said simply. Sharp eyes, Thompson said with a cold smile. Military training? Marcus hesitated. His military service was a matter of public record, and lying about it would only create more problems. Yes, sir. Army. 82nd Airborne. Airborne, Thompson repeated, his tone mocking. Let me guess, you're one of those guys who thinks his military service gives him special privileges. Think the rules don't apply to you. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His military service meant everything to him, not because it gave him privileges, but because it represented sacrifice, honor, and dedication to something bigger than himself. To hear it twisted into something negative by this small-town police officer felt like a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. No, sir, Marcus said through gritted teeth. I believe everyone should follow the law equally. Thompson stepped closer, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having. That's good to hear, because lately we've been having problems with some of these veterans coming back home. PTSD, anger management issues, problems with authority. You having any problems like that, Mr. Williams? Marcus felt his vision narrow slightly, the way it had during firefights in Afghanistan. But instead of enemy combatants, he was facing a police officer in his hometown, a man who was supposed to protect and serve but seemed more interested in intimidation and harassment. I'm fine, officer. I'd really like to go home now. Thompson made a show of looking around the parking lot, as if considering whether to let Marcus leave. The power play was obvious and humiliating, designed to establish dominance and make Marcus feel helpless. Tell you what, Thompson said finally, I'm going to let you go with a warning tonight. But I'll be keeping an eye on you, Williams. This is a peaceful community, and we don't need any troublemakers stirring things up. You understand what I'm saying? Marcus nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to speak. He understood perfectly. Officer Thompson had just marked him as a target, someone to be watched and harassed whenever the opportunity arose. It was a threat disguised as a warning, and there was nothing Marcus could do about it without making things worse for himself. As Marcus got into his car and drove away, he could see Thompson in his rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot with his arms crossed, watching until Marcus's taillights disappeared around the corner. The drive home was short, but Marcus's hands shook on the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from the rage and helplessness that came from being treated like a criminal for the simple act of buying groceries. He'd served his country honorably, sacrificed his body and his peace of mind in defense of the freedoms that Officer Thompson seemed determined to deny him. At his apartment, Marcus sat in his car for several minutes before going inside, trying to calm down and process what had just happened. He thought about calling someone, but who? His parents lived 3 states away and worried about him enough already. His few friends from the military were scattered across the country, dealing with their own struggles. He finally went inside and put away his groceries, the simple domestic task helping to ground him in normalcy. But as he prepared his modest dinner, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter with Officer Thompson was just the beginning of something much worse. 3 days after the grocery store incident, Marcus was walking home from his weekly appointment at the VA clinic when he heard the familiar sound of a police cruiser slowing down behind him. His stomach dropped as he recognized Officer Thompson's voice calling out from the patrol car speaker system. "Hey there, Williams. Stop where you are." Marcus was walking along Elm Street, a quiet residential area where he'd never had any problems before. He was carrying a small paper bag from the pharmacy containing his pain medication and anti-anxiety pills, prescriptions that helped him manage the lingering effects of his military service. The autumn afternoon was peaceful, with children playing in front yards and neighbors working in their gardens. He stopped and turned around, keeping his hands visible as Thompson got out of his patrol car. This time, the officer wasn't alone. A second officer, younger and clearly nervous, emerged from the passenger side. Marcus read his name tag, Officer Rodriguez. "Afternoon, Mr. Williams," Thompson said with that same cold smile Marcus remembered from their previous encounter. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this neighborhood?" "I live here," Marcus replied calmly. "My apartment is 2 blocks away on Pine Street." Thompson exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner. "Funny thing about that, we got a call about someone matching your description looking into car windows about an hour ago. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger and frustration. An hour ago, he'd been sitting in the VA clinic waiting room, surrounded by other veterans and medical staff. At least a dozen people could verify his whereabouts, but he had a sinking feeling that Officer Thompson wasn't interested in facts. "I've been at the VA clinic for the past 2 hours, Marcus said, pulling out his appointment card. "Dr. Martinez can verify that if you need to check." Thompson barely glanced at the appointment card. "The VA, huh? Getting help for those anger management issues we talked about." The comment was clearly intended to embarrass Marcus in front of Officer Rodriguez and any neighbors who might be watching. Marcus noticed an elderly man across the street had stopped raking leaves to observe the confrontation, and a woman walking her dog had slowed her pace to listen. "I received medical treatment for injuries sustained in combat," Marcus said quietly, his military training helping him maintain composure despite the growing humiliation. Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure about the direction this encounter was taking. He was probably in his early 20s, new to the force, and Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't what the young officer had expected when he joined the police force. "Tell you what," Thompson said, stepping closer to Marcus. "Why don't you empty your pockets so we can make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be?" Marcus felt his heart rate spike. "Am I under arrest? Do you have probable cause to search me?" Thompson's expression hardened. "Don't get smart with me, Williams. I'm trying to be reasonable here. You can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way." The threat was barely veiled, and Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. Complying with an illegal search would violate his constitutional rights and set a dangerous precedent for future encounters. But refusing might give Thompson the excuse he was looking for to escalate the situation into something much worse. "Officer Rodriguez," Marcus said, addressing the younger policeman directly, "you know this isn't right." Rodriguez looked between Marcus and Thompson, clearly torn between following his partner's lead and his own sense of what was appropriate. Thompson noticed his partner's hesitation and shot him a warning look. "Rodriguez is learning how we handle troublemakers in this town," Thompson said. "Aren't you, rookie?" The young officer nodded reluctantly, but Marcus could see the conflict in his expression. Rodriguez had probably joined the police force to help people and protect his community, not to harass law-abiding citizens based on nothing more than personal prejudice. Marcus made a decision. He would comply with Thompson's demands, but he would also document everything that happened. Slowly, he pulled out his cell phone and activated the voice recorder app. "I'm recording this encounter for my own protection," he announced clearly. "Officer Thompson, you are asking me to submit to a search without probable cause while I was walking peacefully in my own neighborhood." Thompson's face flushed with anger. "Turn that thing off right now. I have a constitutional right to record police interactions in public spaces," Marcus replied calmly. Supreme Court case Glick versus Cuniff established that precedent. The fact that Marcus knew legal precedent seemed to catch Thompson off guard. The officer hadn't expected this level of knowledge from someone he clearly viewed as an easy target. Marcus's military training had included courses on military law and constitutional rights, knowledge that was serving him well in this civilian encounter. Thompson stepped even closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. "You think you're real smart, don't you? With your fancy legal talk and your military service. Let me tell you something, Williams. This is my town, and you're going to follow my rules." The statement was captured clearly on Marcus's recording, and he could see Officer Rodriguez wince at his partner's words. Thompson had just admitted that this harassment was personal, not based on any legitimate law enforcement purpose. "Officer Thompson," Rodriguez said quietly, maybe you should keep your mouth shut and let me handle this," Thompson snapped at his partner. The young officer's face reddened with embarrassment, but he didn't speak again. Marcus continued recording as Thompson circled around him, clearly trying to find some justification for his actions. The officer peered at the paper bag from the pharmacy with obvious interest. "What's in the bag, Williams?" "Prescription medications from the VA pharmacy. You can see the label if you need to verify that." Thompson grabbed the bag without permission and examined the prescription bottles inside. Marcus bit his tongue, knowing that protesting would only make things worse. The officer read the labels aloud, apparently trying to find something incriminating. "Pain medication and anxiety pills," Thompson announced, as if he discovered something significant. "Interesting combination. You having trouble sleeping, Williams? Nightmares keeping you up at night?" The personal nature of the questions crossed a line that even Officer Rodriguez seemed to recognize. The younger man shifted uncomfortably and glanced around at the growing number of neighbors who had stopped to watch the confrontation. "My medical treatment is between me and my doctor," Marcus said firmly. Thompson handed back the pharmacy bag with obvious reluctance. He'd clearly been hoping to find something that would justify his harassment, but prescription medications from a VA pharmacy hardly constituted criminal evidence. "Here's what's going to happen," Thompson said, his voice low enough that the recording might not pick up every word. "I'm going to be watching you, Williams. Every time you leave that apartment, every time you go to the store, every time you walk down a public street. One mistake, one tiny slip-up, and you're going to find yourself in a world of trouble." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. This was more than harassment now. Officer Thompson was essentially threatening to stalk him, to make his life miserable through constant surveillance and intimidation. It was abuse of power in its purest form. "Are you detaining me, or am I free to go?" Marcus asked, using the formal language he'd learned from online videos about police encounters. Thompson's jaw clenched with obvious frustration. He'd been hoping to provoke Marcus into doing something that would justify an arrest, but the veteran's calm demeanor and knowledge of his rights were making that impossible. "You're free to go," Thompson said through gritted teeth. For now, Marcus pocketed his phone, still recording, and began walking slowly toward his apartment. He could feel both officers watching him, and he made sure to stay on the sidewalk and follow every traffic rule perfectly. Any deviation from perfect behavior might give Thompson the excuse he was looking for. As he reached his apartment building, Marcus glanced back to see the patrol car still parked where he'd left the officers. Thompson was talking animatedly to Rodriguez, probably giving him instructions about how to handle similar situations in the future. Marcus felt sorry for the young officer, who was clearly being trained to follow Thompson's example of harassment and intimidation. Inside his apartment, Marcus sat down at his small kitchen table and transcribed the entire encounter while it was still fresh in his memory. He noted the time, location, witnesses present, and exactly what had been said by all parties. If this pattern of harassment continued, he would need detailed documentation to support any complaints he might file. As he wrote, Marcus reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd spent 2 tours of duty fighting to protect American freedoms in Afghanistan, only to return home and have those same freedoms denied by a small-town police officer who seemed to view the Constitution as more of a suggestion than the supreme law of the land. The phone recording was clear enough to demonstrate Thompson's abuse of power, but Marcus wasn't sure who he could trust to take action. The police department's Internal Affairs Division would likely close ranks around one of their own, especially against the word of an unemployed veteran with PTSD. That evening, as Marcus ate his simple dinner, he made a decision. He wouldn't let Officer Thompson's harassment go unchallenged. There had to be someone in authority who would listen to reason and take appropriate action. He just had to figure out who that someone was. Outside his window, Marcus noticed the same patrol car drive slowly past his building 3 times during the next hour. Thompson was making good on his threat to watch Marcus constantly. The psychological pressure was intended to make Marcus feel like a prisoner in his own neighborhood, afraid to leave his apartment for fear of another confrontational encounter. But Marcus Williams hadn't survived combat in Afghanistan by giving in to intimidation. He'd faced real enemies with real weapons in defense of his country. One corrupt small-town cop wasn't going to break his spirit or drive him away from the community he called home. Over the next 2 weeks, Officer Thompson's campaign of harassment escalated to a level that bordered on stalking. Marcus documented each incident meticulously, building a comprehensive record of what he now recognized as systematic abuse of power. The encounters followed a predictable pattern. Thompson would appear whenever Marcus left his apartment, always with some flimsy justification for stopping and questioning him. A suspicious person report that matched Marcus's description, a concern from local business owners about loitering, an anonymous tip about drug activity in whatever area Marcus happened to be visiting. Marcus had been stopped 7 times in 14 days, each incident more aggressive than the last. Thompson seemed to be testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before Marcus either broke down or fought back. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Marcus was walking to the post office to mail his unemployment benefits paperwork. The autumn air was crisp, and he'd chosen to walk rather than drive, enjoying the exercise and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life despite Thompson's constant surveillance. He was 3 blocks from the post office when he heard the now familiar sound of a patrol car pulling up beside him. This time, Thompson wasn't alone. Officer Rodriguez was in the passenger seat again, along with a 3rd officer Marcus didn't recognize, a middle-aged man with sergeant stripes on his uniform. Marcus's heart sank as he realized that Thompson was now involving other officers in his harassment campaign. The presence of a sergeant suggested that either Thompson had official backing for his actions, or he was about to escalate the situation to a level that required supervisory oversight. Marcus Williams, Thompson called out through the patrol car's loudspeaker, using Marcus's full name as if he were a wanted fugitive. Stop and put your hands where we can see them. The public nature of the announcement was clearly intended to humiliate Marcus in front of any witnesses. Several people on the street stopped to watch as Marcus complied with the command, raising his hands slightly to show they were empty. All 3 officers got out of the patrol car, with Thompson taking the lead and the others flanking Marcus in a formation that looked more appropriate for apprehending an armed suspect than questioning a pedestrian. Sergeant Mitchell, Thompson said, addressing the senior officer, "This is the individual I've been telling you about. Multiple suspicious activity reports in the past 2 weeks." Marcus felt a surge of hope as he looked at Sergeant Mitchell. The older officer had the bearing of a professional law enforcement veteran, someone who might be more interested in facts than personal vendettas. Perhaps Mitchell was here to investigate Thompson's behavior rather than support it. Mr. Williams, Mitchell said in a measured tone, I understand there have been several incidents recently. Can you tell me about your activities in this neighborhood? Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that anything he said could be twisted to justify further harassment. I live on Pine Street, Sergeant. I walk to local businesses for errands and appointments. I've been stopped multiple times by Officer Thompson, but I haven't been charged with any crimes because I haven't committed any. Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Officer Thompson tells me there have been reports of suspicious behavior. Can you explain what you might be doing that's causing concern among local residents? The question was frustrating because it assumed that Marcus was somehow responsible for the harassment he was experiencing. He'd done nothing more suspicious than walking while being a veteran, but explaining that would sound defensive and potentially inflammatory. I don't know what specific behaviors have been reported as suspicious, Marcus said carefully. I follow all traffic laws, I don't loiter on private property, and I conduct my business quickly and politely. If someone has a specific complaint about my actions, I'd like to know what it is so I can address their concerns. Thompson stepped forward, clearly eager to present his version of events. Sergeant, this individual has shown signs of hostility toward law enforcement. He records our interactions and quotes legal precedents like he's some kind of lawyer. Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson called to report that he was walking back and forth on her street multiple times. Marcus felt his temper flare at the distortion of facts. Mrs. Henderson lives on the same street as the VA clinic I was walking to and from my appointment. And I record police interactions because I have a constitutional right to do so, especially when those interactions appear to be based on harassment rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Sergeant Mitchell's eyebrows raised slightly at Marcus's response. The veteran's knowledge of his rights and his calm, articulate manner were clearly not what the sergeant had been led to expect based on Thompson's reports. You're a veteran? Mitchell asked. Yes, sir. 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne. Purple Heart recipient. The information seemed to have an immediate effect on Sergeant Mitchell. His posture shifted slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of what might have been respect in the older officer's eyes. Mitchell was probably a veteran himself, or at least someone who understood the sacrifice that military service represented. What kind of problems are you having with law enforcement, son? Mitchell asked, his tone becoming noticeably warmer. Marcus glanced at Thompson, who was watching the exchange with obvious displeasure. This wasn't going the way the younger officer had planned. Mitchell was supposed to support Thompson's narrative, not question it. Sergeant, Marcus said, choosing his words carefully, I believe I'm being targeted for harassment based on personal bias rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. I've been stopped 7 times in 2 weeks, questioned about my military service, my mental health, and my unemployment status. I've been searched without probable cause and threatened with constant surveillance. I have recordings of these interactions if you'd like to review them. Thompson's face flushed with anger. Sergeant Mitchell, this man is clearly trying to— Officer Thompson, Mitchell said sharply. I'd like to hear what Mr. Williams has to say. The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that someone in authority might finally listen to his concerns. Mitchell had the bearing of a supervisor who took complaints seriously, especially when they involved potential misconduct by his officers. Marcus pulled out his phone and played portions of his recordings from the previous encounters. The sound quality was clear enough to capture Thompson's threatening tone and inappropriate questions about Marcus's medical treatment and military service. As the recordings played, Sergeant Mitchell's expression grew increasingly serious. Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing his own voice in some of the exchanges. Thompson stood rigidly, his jaw clenched with obvious frustration at having his words played back for his supervisor. These recordings document a pattern of harassment that has no basis in legitimate law enforcement activity, Marcus concluded. I'm asking for your help in stopping this behavior before it escalates further. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing what he'd heard. When he spoke, His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough police misconduct to recognize it when it was presented to him. "Officer Thompson, Officer Rodriguez, return to the patrol car. I'll speak with you both shortly." The dismissal was clearly an order, not a request. Both officers reluctantly walked back to their vehicle, leaving Mitchell alone with Marcus. The sergeant waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. "Mr. Williams, what you've described and what I've heard in those recordings is concerning. No citizen should be subjected to that kind of treatment, especially not a veteran who served his country honorably." Marcus felt a wave of relief that someone in authority was finally taking his concerns seriously. "Thank you, Sergeant. I just want to be left alone to live my life peacefully." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I'm going to look into this situation personally. In the meantime, I want you to continue documenting any interactions you have with my officers. If this pattern continues, I need you to call me directly." The sergeant handed Marcus a business card with his direct phone number written on the back. "Day or night, Mr. Williams." "This stops now." As Marcus walked away from the encounter, he could hear Mitchell's voice through the patrol car's open windows, though he couldn't make out the specific words. The sergeant's tone was sharp and clearly angry, suggesting that Thompson and Rodriguez were receiving the kind of dressing down that might actually change their behavior. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he could breathe freely as he walked to the post office. Sergeant Mitchell had listened to his concerns, reviewed the evidence, and promised to take action. It was exactly the kind of professional law enforcement response that Marcus had hoped for, but wasn't sure he would receive. At the post office, the elderly clerk who usually helped Marcus noticed his improved mood. "You're looking better today, young man. Everything all right?" Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I think things are going to get better, Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for asking." As he walked home, Marcus didn't see any patrol cars following him. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he might actually be safe in his own neighborhood. Sergeant Mitchell had given him reason to hope that the system could work, that good officers would hold bad ones accountable when presented with clear evidence of misconduct. But Marcus also knew that this was probably just the beginning. Officers like Thompson didn't give up easily, especially when their authority was challenged by someone they viewed as beneath them. The real test would be whether Sergeant Mitchell could actually control his subordinates, or whether Thompson would find new ways to continue his harassment campaign. That evening, as Marcus prepared dinner in his small apartment, he felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. He'd stood up for himself and found an ally in the police department's chain of command. It was a small victory, but an important one that gave him hope that justice might actually prevail. The temporary peace that followed Marcus's encounter with Sergeant Mitchell lasted exactly 5 days. On Tuesday evening, as Marcus was returning from a job interview at a local auto parts store, he noticed a patrol car parked across from his apartment building. Officer Thompson sat behind the wheel, making no effort to hide his presence. Marcus had spent the afternoon feeling hopeful about the interview. The manager seemed impressed by his military experience and mechanical aptitude, and there was a real possibility of steady employment for the first time since his layoff. The sight of Thompson's patrol car shattered that optimism like glass. As Marcus approached his building's entrance, Thompson got out of his car and called across the street. "Williams, I need to talk to you." Marcus stopped, his hand on the door handle of his apartment building. He was technically on private property now, the threshold of his own home, but he knew that wouldn't necessarily protect him if Thompson was determined to cause trouble. "What can I do for you, Officer Thompson?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger building in his chest. Thompson crossed the street with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his service weapon in what Marcus recognized as an intimidation tactic. The officer's face showed a mixture of anger and satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since his conversation with Sergeant Mitchell. "Funny thing happened today," Thompson said, stopping just outside the reach of the building's security cameras. "Got a report of someone breaking into cars in the parking lot behind Murphy's Bar." Description matches you perfectly. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Murphy's Bar was on the other side of town, at least 3 miles from where he'd been for his job interview. But he realized that Thompson probably didn't care about facts or alibis. This was retaliation for the complaint to Sergeant Mitchell. I was at Hartwell Auto Parts all afternoon for a job interview, Marcus said, pulling out the business card the manager had given him. Mr. Patterson can verify that. Thompson barely glanced at the business card. Interviews don't take all day, Williams. Plenty of time to stop by Murphy's on your way home. The logic was twisted, but Marcus recognized the trap. No matter what alibi he provided, Thompson would find a way to poke holes in it. The officer wasn't interested in investigating actual criminal activity. He was using false reports as a weapon to continue his harassment campaign. Did anyone actually see me at Murphy's bar? Marcus asked, knowing the answer but wanting it on record. Thompson smiled coldly. Anonymous tip. Very reliable source. Marcus reached for his phone to start recording, but Thompson quickly stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. The physical contact was aggressive and clearly intended to provoke a reaction. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Thompson said, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Recording a police officer without permission is a crime in some jurisdictions. Marcus knew that wasn't true, but he also knew that Thompson was hoping he would resist or try to pull away. Any physical response could be interpreted as assaulting a police officer, giving Thompson the excuse he needed for an arrest. You're hurting my wrist, Officer Thompson, Marcus said loudly, hoping that neighbors might hear and potentially witness what was happening. Thompson maintained his grip for several more seconds before releasing Marcus's hand. The message was clear. Thompson could hurt him whenever he wanted, and there wasn't much Marcus could do about it. Here's what's going to happen, Thompson said, his voice low and menacing. You're going to come with me to the station for questioning about this break-in. We're going to have a nice long conversation about your activities today. Marcus felt trapped between impossible choices. Refusing to cooperate would give Thompson an excuse to arrest him for obstruction. But going to the station would put him completely at Thompson's mercy, away from any potential witnesses or recording devices. Am I under arrest? Marcus asked, falling back on the legal knowledge he'd acquired through necessity. That depends on how cooperative you want to be, Thompson replied. It was exactly the kind of ambiguous threat that could be interpreted multiple ways later. If Marcus complained, Thompson could claim he was simply asking for voluntary cooperation. But the implied threat was clear enough to anyone listening. Marcus made a calculated decision. I want to call my lawyer before answering any questions. Thompson's expression shifted to obvious anger. Lawyer? What kind of innocent person needs a lawyer for a simple conversation? Marcus didn't actually have a lawyer, but he knew that invoking legal representation was supposed to stop all questioning until counsel could be present. Unfortunately, that protection only applied after formal arrest and Miranda warnings, not during the gray area of voluntary cooperation that Thompson was exploiting. If I'm not under arrest, then I'm going inside my apartment, Marcus said, reaching again for the door handle. Thompson stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a clear act of intimidation. You know what I think, Williams? I think you've got something to hide. Innocent people don't act paranoid and uncooperative. The circular logic was maddening. Marcus was being accused of guilt because he was trying to protect his constitutional rights. It was the kind of police state mentality that he'd fought against during his military service, now being turned against him in his own hometown. Before Marcus could respond, he heard footsteps approaching from the sidewalk. An elderly woman was walking her small dog, and she slowed down as she noticed the confrontation taking place outside the apartment building. Good evening, Marcus, the woman said warmly. Everything all right here? Marcus recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who lived in the building next door. She was one of the few neighbors who had made an effort to welcome him to the neighborhood when he'd first moved in. Good evening, Mrs. Patterson, Marcus replied, grateful for the unexpected intervention. Thompson turned to face the elderly woman with obvious annoyance. Her presence complicated his ability to continue the harassment without witnesses, and Marcus could see him calculating whether to abandon this encounter or try to intimidate Mrs. Patterson as well. Ma'am, this is police business, Thompson said with false politeness. I'm going to need you to move along. Mrs. Patterson drew herself up to her full height, which couldn't have been more than 5 feet, and fixed Thompson with a stare that Marcus imagined had terrified generations of misbehaving students. "Young man," she said in the tone of someone accustomed to authority, "this is a public sidewalk, and Marcus is my neighbor. I have every right to be here." Thompson's jaw clenched with frustration. He was clearly unused to being challenged, especially by an elderly woman who showed no fear of his uniform or authority. Mrs. Patterson represented exactly the kind of community witness that made police misconduct difficult to hide. "Marcus," Mrs. Patterson continued, ignoring Thompson's obvious displeasure, "would you like me to call someone for you? Perhaps that nice sergeant who came by yesterday to ask questions about the neighborhood." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. Mrs. Patterson had obviously witnessed or heard about his encounter with Sergeant Mitchell, and she was offering him a lifeline that Thompson couldn't easily refuse without appearing obviously corrupt. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said. "I think Sergeant Mitchell would be interested in this conversation." Thompson's face flushed red with anger, but he was trapped by the presence of a credible witness who clearly supported Marcus and had connections to his supervisor. Any further escalation would be impossible to explain or justify. "This isn't over, Williams," Thompson said, his voice barely controlled. "I'll be watching you." As Thompson stalked back to his patrol car, Mrs. Patterson moved closer to Marcus and spoke in a voice low enough that the departing officer couldn't hear. "That young man has been causing problems in this neighborhood for months," she said. "Several residents have complained about his behavior, but nothing seems to get done about it." Marcus felt a mix of relief and concern. Relief that he wasn't the only target of Thompson's harassment, but concern that the problem was apparently widespread and persistent. "Thank you for stepping in, Mrs. Patterson. I really appreciate it." The elderly woman patted his arm gently. "You served our country, Marcus. The least I can do is stand up for you when some bully with a badge tries to push you around." As Mrs. Patterson continued her evening walk, Marcus finally entered his apartment building, but the sense of safety was temporary. Thompson's threat had been clear. This harassment would continue, and it would probably escalate. The officers seemed to view any challenge to his authority as a personal affront that required retaliation. Inside his apartment, Marcus sat down at his kitchen table and added this latest encounter to his growing file of documentation. The pattern was becoming clearer with each incident. Thompson wasn't just a bad cop. He was someone who used his badge to settle personal scores and intimidate people he viewed as threats to his authority. Marcus realized that simply documenting the harassment wasn't enough. Thompson had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop, regardless of warnings from his supervisors. The situation was escalating toward a confrontation that could end very badly for everyone involved. That night, as Marcus tried to sleep, he could hear patrol cars driving slowly past his building multiple times. Thompson was making good on his promise to maintain surveillance, turning Marcus's home into a virtual prison where he was constantly watched and followed. Marcus stared at the ceiling, thinking about his options. He could continue to endure the harassment and hope that Sergeant Mitchell would eventually take more decisive action. He could move away from town and start over somewhere else, essentially letting Thompson drive him out of his own community. Or he could find a way to fight back that didn't involve violence or illegal activity. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't let Officer Thompson destroy his life or drive him away from his home. Tomorrow, he would take the fight to a higher level and find someone with the authority and willingness to stop this abuse once and for all. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for another confrontation with Officer Thompson, he drove to the county courthouse and requested a meeting with the Sheriff's Department Internal Affairs Division. If Sergeant Mitchell couldn't control Thompson, then Marcus would take his evidence to someone with more authority. Sheriff Patricia Hayes was a woman in her 50s with silver streak hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent 30 years in law enforcement. Her office walls were covered with commendations and photographs from community events, suggesting someone deeply invested in public service rather than personal power. Marcus sat across from her desk, his folder of documentation and recordings spread out between them. He'd spent the morning organizing everything chronologically, creating a clear timeline of Thompson's harassment campaign. "Mr. Williams," Sheriff Hayes said after reviewing the materials, "this is extremely troubling. The behavior you've documented represents a serious violation of police conduct standards and potentially several civil rights violations." Marcus felt a wave of relief that someone in authority was finally taking his concerns seriously. Sheriff Hayes had listened carefully to his recordings and asked detailed questions about each incident, treating his complaint with the professional attention it deserved. "Sheriff, I served my country for 6 years, including 2 combat tours. I've never asked for special treatment because of my military service, but I do expect to be treated with the same respect and constitutional protections as any other citizen." Hayes nodded firmly. "That's exactly what you should expect, and I'm sorry that hasn't been your experience with our department. This kind of harassment has no place in professional law enforcement." The sheriff picked up her phone and made a call to her chief deputy. Marcus could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was clear that immediate action was being taken. Hayes was ordering a formal investigation and directing that Officer Thompson be suspended pending the outcome. After hanging up, Hayes turned back to Marcus with a serious expression. "Mr. Williams, I want you to know that this investigation will be thorough and impartial. If the evidence supports your allegations, Officer Thompson will face appropriate disciplinary action, up to and including termination." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the harassment might finally end, but apprehension about potential retaliation from Thompson or his supporters within the police department. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. "Internal Affairs will conduct interviews with all involved parties, including Officer Rodriguez and Sergeant Mitchell. They'll also canvass the neighborhoods where these incidents occurred to identify potential witnesses. Your recordings will be analyzed by our technical team to verify their authenticity." Hayes paused and leaned forward, her expression becoming more personal. "I also want to tell you about something else. Yesterday, I received a call from Colonel James Morrison at the Regional Army National Guard headquarters. He heard about your situation through some mutual contacts." Marcus was surprised and confused. He had no idea how his situation could have reached the attention of military command, or why they would be interested in civilian police misconduct. Colonel Morrison explained that the Guard has been tracking incidents of veteran harassment by local law enforcement as part of a broader study on veteran reintegration challenges. Your case fits a pattern they've been documenting in several communities. The sheriff pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. "The colonel would like to speak with you, if you're willing. The military has resources for veterans facing discrimination or harassment, including legal support and advocacy services." Marcus looked at the business card with growing amazement. Colonel Morrison was listed as the Director of Veteran Affairs for the State National Guard, suggesting that this was an official military interest in his situation rather than just personal concern. "How did Colonel Morrison hear about my situation?" Marcus asked. Hayes smiled slightly. "It turns out that Mrs. Patterson, your neighbor who intervened during your encounter with Thompson, is Colonel Morrison's aunt. She called him yesterday to express concern about how you were being treated." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly woman who had unknowingly connected him with resources he never would have known existed. Mrs. Patterson's intervention was proving to be even more significant than he'd realized. "The military takes care of its own, Mr. Williams. Colonel Morrison wanted me to tell you that your service record is exemplary and that no veteran should face harassment for serving their country honorably." 2 hours later, Marcus found himself in Colonel Morrison's office at the National Guard headquarters, a 40-minute drive from his hometown. The colonel was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command responsibility. "Sergeant Williams," Morrison said, using Marcus's former military rank, "I've reviewed your service record and the documentation you provided to Sheriff Hayes. What you've experienced is unacceptable, and I want you to know that you have the full support of this command." Marcus felt emotions he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. The sense of belonging to something larger than himself, of having brothers and sisters in arms who would stand with him when times got difficult. Sir, I appreciate the support, but I don't want any special treatment. I just want to be left alone to live my life peacefully. Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus carefully. Son, this isn't about special treatment. This is about ensuring that veterans receive the respect and protection they've earned through their service. What Officer Thompson did to you was an attack on every person who's worn the uniform. The colonel explained that the National Guard had been working with civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups to address a growing pattern of police harassment targeting veterans, particularly those with visible disabilities or PTSD diagnoses. We've documented over 200 similar cases in the past 2 years, Morrison said. Veterans being profiled, harassed, and discriminated against by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve them. Marcus was shocked by the scope of the problem. He'd thought his situation was isolated, the result of one bad officer's personal prejudices. Learning that it was part of a broader pattern made him feel less alone, but more concerned about other veterans facing similar treatment. What can be done about it? Marcus asked. Morrison smiled grimly. We're implementing a comprehensive response program, legal advocacy for veterans facing harassment, training programs for police departments on veteran issues, and political pressure for policy changes that protect veteran rights. The colonel picked up a thick folder from his desk and handed it to Marcus. This contains information about free legal services, counseling support, job placement assistance, and other resources available to you. But more importantly, it contains information about how you can help other veterans facing similar situations. Marcus opened the folder and was amazed by the range of services and support programs he hadn't known existed. There were legal aid societies specifically focused on veteran rights, employment programs designed for veterans with disabilities, and advocacy organizations working to change laws and policies. Sergeant Williams, I'm offering you a position as a volunteer advocate with our Veteran Rights Initiative. Your experience, combined with your ability to document and articulate the harassment you've faced, makes you uniquely qualified to help other veterans in similar situations. The offer was unexpected, but appealing. Marcus had been struggling to find purpose and direction since leaving the military, and the opportunity to help fellow veterans gave him a sense of mission that had been missing from his civilian life. What would that involve? Marcus asked. Training in veterans' rights law, police accountability procedures, and advocacy techniques. You'd work with other veterans facing harassment, help them document their experiences, and connect them with appropriate resources and support systems. Morrison paused and looked directly at Marcus. You'd also testify about your experiences at legislative hearings, police training sessions, and community forums. Your story has the power to change minds and protect other veterans for what you went through. Marcus felt a surge of purpose that he hadn't experienced since his military service ended. The idea of turning his painful experience into something that could help other veterans was deeply appealing. I'd be honored to serve in that capacity, sir. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the courtroom as Officer Thompson pleaded guilty to civil rights violations and was sentenced to community service and permanent dismissal from law enforcement. The investigation had uncovered evidence of harassment targeting not just Marcus, but several other veterans and minority residents in the community. Sheriff Hayes had implemented new training requirements for all officers, including mandatory courses on veteran issues and constitutional rights. Officer Rodriguez had been retained with additional supervision and training, having demonstrated genuine remorse for his role in the harassment. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, he saw Mrs. Patterson waiting by the entrance with a small group of neighbors who had come to support him. The elderly woman smiled broadly and gave him a hug that reminded him of his grandmother. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus," she said. "You stood up for yourself and made sure this won't happen to anyone else." 6 months later, Marcus was working full-time as a veteran advocate, helping other former service members navigate challenges with housing, employment, healthcare, and legal issues. His apartment was filled with thank you letters from veterans whose lives had been improved through his advocacy work. The job at the auto parts store had turned into a part-time position that provided additional income and kept him connected to his community. The manager, Mr. Patterson, had been impressed by Marcus's integrity and determination throughout the legal proceedings. On a sunny spring morning, Marcus was walking through downtown when he saw Sergeant Mitchell approaching from across the street. The older officer crossed over and extended his hand with a genuine smile. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to thank you for how you handled that situation with Thompson. Your professionalism and documentation helped us identify and address a serious problem in our department." Marcus shook the sergeant's hand warmly. "Thank you for listening and taking action, Sergeant. That meant everything to me." Mitchell nodded seriously. We've had 3 other veterans come forward since Thompson's dismissal, reporting similar harassment they'd experienced but had been afraid to document. Your courage in speaking up gave them the confidence to seek justice as well." As Marcus continued his walk, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that first encounter in the grocery store parking lot. What had started as a nightmare of harassment and intimidation had transformed into a meaningful career helping fellow veterans and working to reform police practices. He thought about the other veterans he'd helped in recent months. Sarah, an Army medic struggling with PTSD who had been repeatedly arrested for public intoxication when she was actually having panic attacks. David, a Marine veteran with a prosthetic leg who had been accused of drug dealing because of his frequent visits to the VA clinic. Jennifer, an Air Force veteran who had been harassed by her landlord because of her service dog. Each case had reminded Marcus that his experience wasn't unique, but it had also shown him that the system could work when people with courage and determination demanded accountability and justice. That evening, as Marcus prepared for another day of advocacy work, he received a phone call from Colonel Morrison with news about a bill pending in the state legislature that would provide additional protections for veterans facing discrimination. "Your testimony before the Judiciary Committee was instrumental in building support for this legislation," Morrison said. "The committee chair specifically mentioned your case as an example of why these protections are necessary." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction that his painful experience was being transformed into positive change that would benefit other veterans for years to come. He had found his post-military mission, ensuring that those who had served their country with honor would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved when they returned home. As he hung up the phone, Marcus looked out his apartment window at the peaceful neighborhood street where he'd once been harassed and threatened. Now it represented home in the truest sense, a place where he belonged, where he was valued, and where he was making a difference in the lives of others who had worn the uniform in service to their country.